Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kathy Jacobs. I'm the director of the Center for Climate Adaptation, Science and Solutions, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this event today. This TED Talk event is actually Mary's and my favorite event of our CCASS season. We always have great conversations, and we really look forward to today's. As usual, it's extremely interdisciplinary, which is actually the point. We have people from 5 different departments, and I'm guessing it's at least 3 different colleges, but it might even be more than that. I didn't actually figure that out. So the way we do the format is that each one of the speakers gets exactly 5 minutes, and we just yank them right off the stage when the 5 minutes is up. And then we will have a conversation between them and the audience at the end. And so we're not going to ask questions during the time that they're giving their presentations. We're just going to go boom, boom, boom right through them. But please do keep track of the questions that you might have. The main point of this is actually to sort of spread interdisciplinarity, to help particularly physical scientists know more about what social scientists do, but vice versa. And we've actually seen a lot of really interesting things happen as a result of the conversations that we've been hosting, including some new research projects where people invite others onto teams to join them as a result of what we talk about here. So Monica is first, so if you want to trundle down here while I'm introducing you. Monica is actually one of my, she's on the faculty of SWEST, Soil, Water, and Environmental Science, which is my home department. She has her PhD from the University of Arizona, and she has 2 undergraduate degrees from the University of Arizona. But she took off and went to Northeastern for a while, and also has a degree in public administration from Columbia University. So she does public administration and soil and water science and risk communication. She focuses a lot on underserved communities and is in particular interested in connecting science and decision making. So with that, if and when you're ready, just let us know, and we'll start the clock and you can have at it. You all hooked up?
Yeah.
All right, great.
Okay,
Thank
ready?
you, Monica. Go for it.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. As you know, I'm Monica Ramirez, and I have a joint appointment in Public Health, Division of Community Environment and Policy. So while working in the field as an environmental health scientist, you quickly realize to get things done, you need to probably not just do your physical and chemistry, your physical sciences and chemistry. And so with that, I designed the Environmental Research Translation Framework, starting off with the transdisciplinary team, effective collaboration, information transfer, public participation, or what I'll call citizen science throughout this intro, and a culture model of risk communication. And so working and operating from this framework, it is inherent to use social science tools to be an effective environmental health researcher. And so when I do citizen science or promotora science, some of you might be aware of that work, and in working to improve environmental health literacy, you aim to align research and education with community priority, plan co-management, engage the community at every step, incorporate multiple forms of knowledge, so recognizing there's more than one way to view the challenge or the solution, reporting individual results back, as well as broad dissemination. So this is incredibly important when working with communities in environmentally compromised spaces. And then a culture model of risk communication. So essentially understanding your audience to tailor the way you communicate risk. And at this stage, this is where communication and art skills come into play. And so when I look at, social science tools come into play, one, on how to do this effectively, but an evaluation of how these steps should be implemented and what are the outcomes of this type of work. When specifically looking at public participation or citizen science, you want to understand, and it's been shown, so evidence-based, that participants of citizen science, so that partnership between the scientists as well as volunteers or non-scientists to generate new knowledge, right? We've seen that you can see an advancement in our understanding of science, so we know more about migratory birds, butterflies. In my work, we know more about soil quality and uptake patterns of deleterious elements in plants. Socio-ecological, so understanding participants, one, are motivated, but participate in citizen science because they want to have access and use of data to address environmental degradation. They want strategic interventions to protect the environment. And at the individual level, we've seen that the individual or the participant themselves might have a new skill set, social skill set, because there's engaging with others in the scientific method, and improve their stewardship. But how do we know? And so this is really where I tie in social science tools, is to think about how do we elicit and work with communities to understand types of outcomes of citizen science work. A larger proponent of what I do is reporting data back to participants, or data sharing at the individual level. And so when I was at Northeastern University, so I did my postdoc with a medical sociologist, and then was hired on in the Department of Health Science. But as doing my postdoc, I spent a good amount of time working with Silent Spring Institute and Phil Brown under an R01 they had about looking at personal exposure report back ethics. And so how do people report data back? What do participants gain and use from the results? And using this information from these evaluations, in this case, semi-structured interviews, to best develop best practices for results communication. And so using semi-structured interview process, as well as a level of engagement and ongoing discussions, participants tend to want a description, analysis / comparison, and recommendation once they get their data back. And so I did this work with a biomonitoring study in a mining community, asking parents what they did once they had their children's blood lead levels and arsenic urinary concentrations, inorganic arsenic. I also use social science tools from the social science field, in this case, focus groups, interviews, public participation in general, to improve exposure assessment. And so here you see this is in Boston, where asking people what should be added to the exposure assessment, how much they actually eat and what they grow, and reusing what they define their intake to be, and using those in the exposure assessment calculation to better predict their exposure to things that might cause them harm, in this case, urban gardens and lead. And that's it.
Great, thank you very much. That was extremely impressive. So our next speaker is Dr. Casey Ernst. She's an associate professor in epidemiology and biostatistics in the College of Public Health. And she has the good or bad fortune, depending on how you want to look at it, of being a mosquito-borne disease expert at a time when one of the biggest disease outbreaks of concern has occurred in this country, which is the whole issue with dengue and Zika and other things like that. She's interested in the risk of Aedes-borne diseases in arid lands, including the Arizona-Sonora border region. She works in interdisciplinary teams. It includes individuals from climatology, geography, medical anthropology, and entomology. So yet another person who's really good at this, this whole interdisciplinary stuff. And she's informed me that the insects that have been biting my ankles in my house are in fact this nasty mosquito that I should be worried about. Yeah. Anyway, go for it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thanks for having me today. So Zika, dengue, and chikungunya and malaria are all what we call climate-sensitive diseases. Basically, the association between climate and weather and these diseases is the pathway through the mosquito. So the bionomics of the mosquito are dictated by temperature, precipitation, and humidity. There's also climate effects through the temperature-sensitive EIP, the extrinsic incubation period of the pathogen. So there are also indirect effects that people don't really think about. So there may be changes in people's behaviors as the climate changes, as it gets warmer. There may be people who are storing more water that can now be habitat for the vector. So we have to bring in this social behavioral processes to really understand how things are going to change in the future. So in order to recommend adaptation strategies, we have to be able to identify what the actual future risk is going to be. So how do we determine the association between weather and climate patterns and mosquito-borne diseases when there's all of these complexities? So as an epidemiologist, when I first came in, I thought, okay, well, great, we'll just find long-term disease data sets, correspond that with some of the weather patterns, and really we can project that into the future. That really is actually extremely difficult for a couple of reasons. Number one, finding really good long-term disease data sets is extremely difficult. And when you do find a long-term disease data set, there's a lot of confounders that could be included in there. Changes in healthcare infrastructure, changes in disease testing, changes in treatment that might alter people's transmission levels. You can't really directly correlate, and that leads to what we call black box epidemiology, where you have an exposure going in, climate variables, and you have an outcome coming out, the disease. And it looks like they're correlated, but you really don't know what's going on in the middle there. And in order to really be able to nicely project what's going to happen in the future, you have to understand those processes that are going on in that sort of black box. So in order to get around that, we as a team, my team of multiple people that was alluded to previously, have put together a process-based model that actually originated with a graduate student here at the University of Arizona. It's called DIMSIM. And what that does is it leverages decades worth of laboratory science and field science to really look at what are the relationships between temperature, precipitation, and these bionomics of the disease vector. So we can take these known relationships and put them into a model. Right now, the model is performing quite well in terms of being able to look at disease incidence, but there are some years where it's not as good. So when we did a validation in Puerto Rico, we found that when you had 3 of the 5 years in which we validated, it was excellent. You know, we had 85% correlation with disease incidence. But there was 1 year that was particularly troublesome. And when we looked into it a little closer, we identified that we hadn't really accounted for some of these social behaviors, chiefly the use of manually filled containers. And understanding that when you have a drier season, people are actually more likely to water in their yard. They're more likely to have containers where they're storing water in open places, leading to that increased vector habitat. So in order to recommend, how does this all play into adaptive capacity? So we have a model that's working fairly well in the field. We're able to mimic dengue cases quite well, and I'm kind of going backwards. So some people actually start with the social science. We're trying to put more of the social science in as we've gone along. And so our team actually has a really strong social science skill set. Mary Hayden's a medical anthropologist, and she's going to have a really critical role, as am I as an epidemiologist. So in order to really actually go to stakeholders and say, hey, we have this model that's showing that you're going to have an increased risk of disease transmission 30 or 40 years down the road, you have to figure out how to communicate that, right? Because public health partners don't think about 30 or 40 years down the road. They think about whether or not there's an outbreak next week. And so after some initial conversations, our group's becoming more convinced that short-term predictions may be useful. So our next step is going to be to engage more rigorously with the stakeholder groups. I have a graduate student, Mona Aurora, who's conducting parallel surveys with stakeholders in public health, and one in a group like ours that's creating models and projections. She has an initial list of public health partners, and we're going to be asking them about the scale of information, system management, and intended user use of the information. And then following that, we want to have a stakeholder survey in which we gather public health, vector control, municipal managers, meteorologists, and healthcare representatives to really answer some key questions about spatial resolution for projections, how to rectify the different needs of local, state, and federal stakeholders, frequency of projections, spatial versus temporal depictions of risk, etc. So I think these next steps are going to be the most critical for our project, because if we can actually identify things that will be useful information to lead to public health action, that's the direction that we really want to go. Having a model that just sits there and does a great job in the ivory tower is not going to be effective.
Thank you very much, Casey. And Don, you're up next. So Don Falk has spent a lot of his life outside of academia, as well as quite a bit inside academia. His research focuses on fire history, disturbance ecology, and adaptation of restoration ecology to resilience in a changing world. and I've actually observed him doing this in a project that I'm involved in with him. He has a history of working, for example, at the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard University, at San Diego Zoo Global. He's been the executive director of the Society for Ecological Restoration. He's written books on the genetics and conservation of rare plants, foundations of restoration ecology, and the landscape ecology of fire. So he has really been working a lot at the interface between society and management of forestry and public lands and plants and animals and all that. Anyway, you ready to go?
I'm ready.
Are you nervous?
Not the slightest.
Okay.
No, but I should point out, despite that introduction, that when Kathy invited me, I wrote back and said as politely as possible that I was fairly sure she had invited the wrong person because I'm not a social scientist by any stretch of the imagination. And she said, no, we really meant to invite you. And so that gave me a chance to think about what I do from a social science perspective. And really, it all revolves around this word resilience.
I think you're starting.
I am starting.
Oh, okay, go for it.
Yeah, I squeezed in an extra 20 seconds, right? It starts when you sit down, right? Yeah, there's like a button on your chair that starts the timer. For me, it revolves around this question of resilience. And I study resilience from an ecological perspective as a plant community and ecosystem response to disturbance. As Kathy said, I spend a lot of my time just studying disturbed ecosystems. But it has given me a chance to rethink that from a different perspective. And I became persuaded in the course of preparing for this event that there is a very strong social science perspective that could be applied. And so I'm going to walk through 5 reasons why I think that is true and why I think it's a legitimate perspective. So this is an ecosystem at a tipping point. This is in the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico after the 2011 Las Conchas fire. What you were looking at here a week before I took this picture would have been a mixed conifer forest, fully populated with multiple species of conifers, with running water, with soils that are several centuries old. And what you see now is basically a Bayer template, pretty much primary succession. When ecosystems get to this point, they are at a tipping point, meaning that they may, but may not, go back to their previous configuration. That's a profoundly difficult and challenging ecological question because we don't know those dynamics. The reason I study disturbance is that disturbed ecosystems, unlike the disturbed ecologists who study them perhaps, is the prevailing condition around in ecosystems in most of the world. And not all these disturbances are anthropogenic or outside the range of variability, as you see here. Disturbance is a central and essential characteristic of ecosystem functioning pretty much for all terrestrial ecosystems. So we have to map what we understand about disturbance and historically onto the way disturbances are operating today and ask whether we are out of the range of variability. You notice that I mentioned it's a multiplier, there are strong feedbacks. How this all plays out then has a very profound impact on the way lands are managed. And this is our first clue to looking at resilience from a social science perspective, because land managers are now having to think about landscapes like this instead of the one that existed the week before the fire. The specific disturbance that I study is wildfire. And again, this has a background in the range of variability of being a natural process, but we have seen wildfire as a very sensitive response variable to both management and climate change. And this is the second clue about how we could look at this, bringing in a social science perspective married to an ecological perspective. So the reason wildfire is such a wild card is that we have the climate ratchet, as Steve Jackson and Julio Betancourt have described it, and then we superimpose on that these extreme disturbance events, which are essentially a major reset for an ecosystem. And this obviously completely changes the land management paradigm moving forward. So we can see this in 2 ways. First of all, these kinds of fires are the result of management practices. This is a map of, do we have a pointer up here? Point with my finger. Sorry. This is a map, thank you. Oh, don't worry. Okay, so what you see here are fire sizes in the state of Arizona in acres on the y-axis, starting in 1990 and going up through a few years ago. And you'll see that until about 2000, a 20 to 30,000 acre fire was considered huge. Those were the big fires we were seeing. Right around 2000, we jump up literally in order of magnitude. We are now seeing 400 to 500,000 acre fires, not routinely, but they are no longer rare, and they are definitely part of our landscape. That is partly the result of our management decisions, which in turn are driven by the social consensus about how to manage forests, and by abrupt climate change, which again is driven by the social consensus about, no worries, about energy policy and the drivers of changing climate. And so if we look behind this trend, what I'm saying is there are not only ecological but strong social and political forces behind this, and indeed we really can't interpret this change, this major change in ecosystems, without that understanding. Third, the consequences of this, these changes are clearly economic and social as well as ecological. This is another part of the aftermath of the Las Conchas fire. And again, this would have been a recreation-rich, wildlife-rich, carbon-rich landscape. And it is right now none of those things, and will probably be none of those things for many decades to come. Lastly, I've been reminded recently that all the old causes of degradation that we studied at the beginning of our career before climate change became front and center are still there. We still have site scale destruction of habitat. We have dysfunctional transportation patterns. We still have invasive species. And so there is an interesting article in Frontiers just earlier this year that I recommend, where it's pointed out that climate can actually become, in some senses, a distraction from the many other sources of degradation that continue to operate. And of course, the social consensus behind all of these is more clear because it's more immediate and site scale. Lastly, then, where ecological resilience intersects with social science is first how agencies make decisions, because they have no policy framework for dealing with anything that I've discussed presently. They have no policy framework or guidance for how to decide what to do about an ecosystem that's reached a tipping point. This is terra nova for them, and they are without guidance. And it also requires us to have a social consensus about what to do about ecosystem alteration, some of which is probably adaptive, and some of which reflects a legacy of degradation, which we'll have to untangle for many decades to come. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Don. I'm glad you've examined your priorities and decided to become a social scientist. Chris Knudsen is our next victim up here, and he is actually very new to our community, to the point that I actually just met him this morning. He's a postdoctoral research associate working with Diana Liverman. His research centers on climate change, hazards, Caribbean development, and global political economy. And he comes from a hotbed of geographical thought, which is Clark University. So you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
All right, well, we'll go forward then.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to be talking about some new research I've just started this semester with a colleague from the London School of Economics. And kind of builds on what Don was talking about. So the project is examining how land trusts in the United States are taking up into their operations new ecological science on resilience to help them manage the land under their management to help adapt to climate change. So really it's about increasing their lands to climate change. And just a working definition, we can think about land trusts as operating under a framework where a landowner gives certain rights to a land trust in order to preserve and conserve nature on their land. Now, for about 5 years now, the umbrella organizations for land trusts in the US, the Land Trust Alliance, has been trying to get this sort of cutting-edge ecological science into the hands and into the operations of local land trusts, particularly by helping them, training them to use modeling and decision-making software in their land acquisitions to purchase and manage lands that are going to be most resilient to climate change into the future. And so the method that I'm going to be focusing on is interviews, because what you can find if you're interested in how land trusts are dealing with increasing climate resilience is you can go to the Land Trust Alliance's website, and there are all these documents that are talking about how ecological science is being taken up into the practice of land trusts. But it's a very public face about how this is going on. It's very homogeneous. It's sort of conflict-free, very smooth. And through interviews, so we've interviewed 6 land trusts in the US that have been highlighted by the Land Trust Alliance as being particularly successful in implementing new resilient science. And so we focused on interviewing executive directors and land acquisition directors to really talk about, okay, how is this actually going on in your organizations to bring this sort of really new way and really complex way of increasing climate resilience. And so what we found was, I'll just talk about a few interviews. One in Nebraska, what they said was that resilience to them, when the Land Trust Alliance talks to them about it, they really just think, oh, this is some new buzzword. It's kind of like sustainability. In fact, it's kind of indistinguishable to us from sustainability. And really, resilience, sustainability, really they're just things that we already do. He called it Midwestern common sense. There's stuff that ranchers have been doing for generations to take care of their lands, so it's nothing really new. An executive director in Michigan, he was so uncomfortable talking about resilience, refused to say the word, said that even if he was pressed for it, he probably couldn't even spell it. But that resilience was a word that he had to put in funding applications to get money. Contrast that with New York. We interviewed a land trust, which was one of the biggest and one of the oldest in the US. And they had been doing resilience work before the Land Trust Alliance got interested in it 5 years ago. I mean, when Superstorm Sandy happened in 2012, they had long-standing work on resilience. And they bristle a bit with the Land Trust Alliance as sort of like what they call sort of the overbearing and top-down approach to sort of pushing their operationalization of resilience into their activities. And so really, when we think about the kind of methods of interviews, what can they do? Well, they are, I think, a nice way of looking behind the public face of these documents. Sort of the documents about how the land trusts are implementing resilience are sort of the official voice of it. By interviews, you get to sort of see the complexities and the sort of negotiations that go on to actually implement this really complex science. And sometimes I worry sometimes maybe resilience in the, interviews in the social sciences might be a bit undervalued because of how much time it takes to set up the interview, research for them, conduct them, transcribe them, analyze them. And of course, all the time we have right here beside us, we have this little device which has access to all of these documents that are relevant, all this data relevant to our research. And we think, well, why would we even bother doing interviews? And sometimes it's important to remember that this little device also has one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest social science tool ever invented for doing research, and that's the telephone. Sometimes I almost forget you can actually make calls with this thing and not just go on the internet. But interviewing is really key, I think, along with the sort of the official voice you get in documents to really see behind that story. And I would always think of interviewing as sort of a really key part of getting the whole story when doing your research. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. And finally, we're going to end up with a word from, or several words, I'm guessing, from an economist, Tariq Ramzan, who is an associate professor of economics in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics. He was a visiting professor of law and economics at the University of Oslo in 2011. He has a very wide range of research interests, including development economics, health economics, and law and economics. He's studied human well-being, child labor, child and elderly health, environmental justice, environmental regulations, and I happen to know he's also studied things related to climate. Some of his current research projects include women's agency, role of political theater, and role of climate information service for development. Tawhid, you are up.
Okay, thank you. So actually today what I'm going to talk about is few tools that economists have stolen from other disciplines and have advanced it a little bit further in a more nuanced way, and how does that apply to adaptation to climate change. So, you know, most of the development programs and policies are often designed to change outcomes. For example, how to raise income, improve learning, or reduce illness. Whether those desired changes are achieved or not are often not examined. Usually what happens, the program managers and the project people, they will try to quantify the inputs and outputs. For example, how much money is just spent, how many people attended the workshop, how many schools were constructed. And these are useful exercise, but they do not answer the crucial public policy questions, whether the program for which it was designed, did it achieve the intended goal. That is where program evaluation comes into the picture. Program evaluation has 5 essential elements. And the first is you start with a problem. What is the problem? Then you have a well-argued and very nuanced theory of it, that how your program that you are designing, when it is implemented theoretically, will produce the desired outcomes. The third important element is that is the intended program working the way you want it? The process is working as you wanted. Why? Because a lot of programs, what happens, there is a demand side constraint, there is a supply side constraint, we make a lot of assumptions and things never go as we plan. The fourth crucial element is impact. So you have started with a problem, you designed an intervention, you want to know whether it produced the results, and not only it produced the results, what was the magnitude of it. Finally, the most important questions from economic point of view is that, let's say your program had an impact, you know the magnitude, but what is the cost benefit of it? That money could have been spent on a variety of other programs, right? So you want to know whether the impact magnitude is sufficient enough that it warrants further investment in that particular program. Now, in this case, impact evaluation, which is very important, has actually taken the field of development economics, which is what I am primarily, by a storm. And there, the focus is about something called, this gives you some example of the recent program evaluation I have been involved as an advisor for World Bank in South Asia. So the first one is a huge multi-billion-dollar World Bank program, which I did just a study with many economists with the World Bank. Second one is also World Bank project. And the third one is just we have in our audience Professor James Biger and Guido Jackery is also here. We just did the evaluation of climate drought forecast information service in Jamaica. So these are recent examples where program evaluation is very useful. When it comes to program evaluation and impact, particularly the fourth component, the crucial issue is causality. So what is causality? Causality is that I did X, and because of that, Y happened. Causal inference is one step further. I did X, Y happened because of X, not because of anything else. And the way it looks like is that basically you have a particular problem you want to solve, you choose the timing of design the intervention, and you see you have 2 groups. One is the people who participate in your program, and then you have a counterfactual group with which to compare. The difference you compare, you have the impact. This is in economics now, particularly in development economics, it is called randomized control trial. Randomized control trial. And so this is really important because impact evaluation is not new. But what is new now, which is happening, is attribution. Not only you identify and estimate the impact, but you attribute to the intervention you design. And that's a really interesting thing which is happening. The last tool I want to talk about, which I am actively involved, is behavioral experiments. So sometimes what happens is that, for example, when you think about development, or whether you are thinking about adaptation to climate change, what you find is that the changes which are required are difficult to change because of a variety of reasons. Inertia, institutional constraint, norms, cultural practices. These are the primary driver of why change is not happening, whether it is in terms of development programs or in terms of adaptation to climate change and other things, and it doesn't happen. So, So behavioral experiment is, it allows you to measure things which are not easily quantifiable. For example, you can talk about how to measure stereotype, coordination, and other things. The last, and I will stop it, is the role of gender. So for example, let's say in climate science adaptation, particularly in Africa, there have been many studies where people are looking at the role of gender. And what happens is, that is always, if you read the papers, mostly it is wrong. Why? Gender is highly correlated with other attributes, socioeconomic status. So you don't know to what extent it is because of socioeconomic attributes, to what extent it is because of gender. And all these tools are now being used. Recently, many of you know that President Obama announced behavioral science group to improve the efficiency of climate change policies in the United States. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Tawhid. So we're going to ask all of the speakers to come down and sit in front here. And I'm going to start by asking them a question, and we can decide who answers first. But then I want all of you to be thinking of things you'd like to hear from them. First of all, I have to say that it makes me proud to work here, to listen to the incredibly impressive people that we have to speak with us today. I think it's just amazing to have such a breadth of perspective and so many different views on sort of the intersection between science and policy. So thank you to all of you for really doing a fabulous job. You're all great communicators, and I'm very impressed. Just put that marker down. Okay, so the question I want to ask is it an artificial distinction to talk about social science versus physical science, given that we are all human beings and we live in a society even if we're physical scientists? So I know there's actually three microphones up here, so you can just grab one. Are any of you particularly interested in answering that question? Okay, Dr. Falk.
Thanks, Kathy. I'll provide an example of where I think these two perspectives on the world join and necessarily join, and that is what we do, taking the case of the degradation of ecosystems that I described. That can be studied from an ecological perspective, but we get to a point where the state of a severely degraded system, and it could be a badly polluted river, it could be a destroyed coastline, it doesn't have to be the kinds of post-fire examples that we study. At a certain point, the decisions revolve entirely around social consensus about what to do next. And in fact, it even goes beyond that to the question of whether the system is viewed as degraded or simply moving into an alternative state. So after big disturbances, a lot of ecosystems will take a very different form, and an ecologist might say, oh, that's just long-term succession. Just wait a couple of 100 years and it'll come right back. And society is unlikely to have that kind of patience, especially in protected areas. And so necessarily we start imposing our values and our social consensus even on the way we perceive and evaluate the landscape.
Who else would like to jump in here?
I'll just make one statement. The fact that you might be conducting science and you're not thinking about public participation in decision making or in this generation of science or understanding local knowledge to inform your science is unfortunately a deficit that I think that the physical or whatever you want to call it, like physical, social, isolating the scientific question from the people and not collaborating, co-generating solutions has been a deficit of the scientific enterprise.
And I would echo that. I mean, I think that with the work that I'm doing, I'm sort of I don't know what I am. I don't know if I'm a biomedical scientist or a social scientist. EPIs are sort of just this sort of quasi mix of things. So I kind of walk in both worlds, but with the model that we built, we were really focused on getting all of these biophysical processes down and making sure that all of the bionomics of the vector were just right. And then we started to realize that, there's this huge human behavioral component that has to be included, or it's not going to be very accurate, and it's not going to do a lot of, the predictions won't be quite right. So I think, and then just trying to figure out, okay, how do we actually move this nicely validated model as we've added on these additional components? How do you actually move it into something that's actionable? And I think that's where there's a big gap, because when you think about the physical scientists and just in terms of how you think about scale and how you would need to have completely different scales for the social sort of action that would need to be taken from public health partners, you really do have to start to have those bridges. And I think it's getting there. I do think that disciplines are starting to break down a little bit more, but it's still a work in progress.
The project that I was talking about, so one aspect is really acknowledging that it's impossible to just focus around the ecological resilience of a land trust without also talking about the institutional resilience. And so that's really a concept which you would be, I think, mistaken to put all your emphasis just on the ecology. So that if certain practices to increase ecological resilience reduced institutional resilience, for example, one of the things we're looking at is certain land trusts in certain parts of the U.S. where it's alienated the community members to talk about climate change, it may be dangerous to promote ecological resilience through the climate change angle if you're undermining your institutional resilience. Because the institutional resilience sort of has to precede the ecological resilience, because if the land trust dissolves through bankruptcy, for example, lack of community support, then the work that they're doing to maintain and improve ecological resilience will disappear.
So I agree everything which was said here, but I just want to emphasize that I do think that disciplinary boundary is very important. The boundary itself is dynamic; it can move around. And so reality is that you can't be everything in every place, everywhere, So the disciplinary boundary is important. But what is important, the idea here is that learning from each other. That when you are doing a project that involves the insights from different field, it is important that the scholars and researchers from different field collaborate and work together and contribute. But disciplinary boundary has its purpose and why it has persisted for centuries, So.
Great. Tawhid, I'm going to ask you one question, and then I'm looking for somebody out here to have their hand up. So my question for you is, it can't be new news from the front that in order to measure the impact of a program, that you have to have a baseline, and you have to have a theory of change, and you have to actually measure something after the fact. Why is it that it never happens? I mean, when huge amounts of money are being spent, why is that?
So this is a really important question. So I think there are multiple, and I will answer in multiple parts, and which will be not exhaustive. One part is there are a lot of projects which you do. You know that obviously there is a demand for it. So for example, constructing primary care health center, the places which don't have primary care health center, promoting access to clean water. You don't have to justify that it is useful. Only question will be the economics of it, right? So a part of the reason why many programs are not evaluated for their impact is because their impact is too obvious. There are certain fundamental things which are missing, and you are just providing access to. A second part of the answer is, a lot of times people don't know how to do it. I mean, it is complex, right? So it is easier, and you are always responding to the grant agencies, So it happens is that you tailor your ideas. You always are biased to produce the results in a quick manner. So you do a lot of monitoring, counting what you are doing activities. You do it, But it is very it is complicated. But I think now we have made a lot of progress in the last 20 years in terms of impact evaluation.
Great. Okay, so I'm looking for some questions from all of you out there. Yes, go ahead. And please identify yourself. And in fact, say please sign in if you haven't. There should be sheets going around.
Hi, I'm Bob Cook with Sustainable Tucson, and I'm trying to formulate the question, and let me try this. One of the things that I didn't hear today was the concept of scenarios, and the reason I wondered why it was missing is that in climate science, and we find that, you know, scientists are dealing with incredible nonlinearities and uncertainties. And if you look at the IPCC work, you have lots of different scenarios. And these scenarios change every time a new assessment is published. Given the fact that different scenarios entail perhaps different adaptation strategies, how do you deal with the cost effectiveness of a program if you're making assumptions about a scenario that are way off? Because I think we're coming into a time where we're seeing these nonlinearities more strikingly when, now that we have a global carbon budget and we know really the time frames that we're going to have to be dealing with mitigation for keeping us at 2 degrees or 2.5 or 3 or 4. These gradients completely change the landscape for all the work you're doing. So how do we get a better sense of are we being effective with our research dollars and our public dollars, given the fact that we're dealing with many different kinds of scenarios here?
So I'll start with a response. So I think that that's actually something that I struggle with a lot, and that's one of the reasons why in conversations with stakeholders who have said, yeah, you know, 40, 50, 80 years from now, who knows what's going to happen? And what level of uncertainty are people actually willing to accept in order to then take action around? So that's one of the questions that we're really going to try and address with the stakeholder workshops that we're going to be doing with these models of Aedes aegypti disease risk in the future. What kind of certainty do you need in order to start mobilizing more resources for spraying or for vector control trucks to go around? I think that's a really important question. And it's something that I don't quite know the answer to for my problem yet, but I think we're going to hopefully get an answer about that soon.
To a time when we really have to abandon certain regions of the planet because of the change of the precipitation belts. We see the dramatic changes that are happening in the way our climate is actually structured, and whether it makes any sense to try to save it all.
On that last question, there is work on globally imperiled biomes and large-scale plant communities driven solely by climate. And these are generally multi-decadal to centennial changes, but it's certainly strongly driven by scenarios. Thank you for your question, by the way. Scenarios were minute 6 of my 5-minute presentation. In terms of ecological transitions, what you're saying is absolutely correct. If we look at the big disturbance agents that punctuate this steady ratchet of climate, wildfire, insect outbreaks, spread of invasive species, a number of other processes, they're very sensitive to global and regional temperature and precipitation signals. Wildfire is especially sensitive to temperature, as is tree dieback. So number of projections under even moderate scenarios show much of the western U.S. becoming uninhabitable for the dominant tree species that we've grown up assuming would always be there. So that's based entirely on the climate scenario and current physiological research. The problem is scaling up small-scale laboratory experiments and empirical observations under current climate to the climate 50 years down the road. And of course, that's a modeling exercise. We've done that for wildfire area burned, and the models returned for us indications the wildfire area could be introducing by 200 to 800% in certain parts of the West. So if that's true, or even if we're only 50% wrong, it suggests a hypersensitivity to scenario in terms of disturbance processes.
I guess what I think, I'll indirectly add a response or indirectly respond to your answer and talk about risk perception, right? I mean, so you'll lay out your scenarios and you can communicate, but if you're not, you have to recognize the way that that decision maker or community or whoever you're working with perceives the risk to be. And I think that, you know, I guess it for me is an area of my research and very interesting to me about how do you go about understanding how someone perceives risk. So environmental health, right? If you look at smoking, the risk of smoking or the risk of dying in a car accident compared to the risk of dying from a chronic low-level exposure and developing cancer over time, the latter is much more difficult and abstract to interpret and embody. And so I think that the perception of risk and when we're doing this type of communication is important with regards to each of our topics.
Really, really important question, because, you know, so think about as you described very beautifully, that climate change scenario is a different scenario you have. You can range from very mild change to extreme change. And then you are thinking about what kind of intervention and program you can have to promote adaptation, you know. In economics, particularly environmental economics nowadays, people are doing, you know, so you can have a theoretical model. It is not empirical, but, you know, you can have a theoretical model where you can imagine different scenarios, you know, of climate change in terms of volatility in temperature, long-term precipitation, all those things. And you can come up with the kind of impacts it is likely to have on agriculture, livelihood, urbanization, population, diseases, all those things. And then within that, you can play around with different kind of policies under different scenario, different kind of projections, which are likely to be successful. You know, so it is true that, let's say if extreme climate event happens and extreme change, it is quite possible that adaptation is not going to be sufficient. You know, so relocation, migration changes, so pattern of living will change, you know, and people are starting to think about those kind of things.
Chris, did you want to add anything, or you?
I'll just say briefly, I've also done work on insurance around climate change, and there's a lot of scenario planning with regards to that. And one of the dangers, I guess, with treating adaptation more on the insurance side is that those scenarios, those worst case scenarios, can actually start to allow to happen because you have the confidence that losses will be protected through insurance. And so one of the things about scenario planning I always think about is, you know, what uses are they put? Are they actually, do scenarios allow you to actually go further with the protection of insurance and other adaptation plans?
Great, yes.
Hi, I'm Ashwin Naidu at the School of Natural Resources. I'm part of the Desert Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and I have a question particularly for the panel. There was a lot of talk recently about advocating for approaches and methods, and including all the way from citizen science to the individual level to projects involving large communities. And one of the big questions that came up is, okay, there's this big barrier to advocacy from scientists, and if scientists need to, we all feel passionately about a lot of issues that we can address at the individual level, at our community level, so on and so forth. However, a lot of scientists are barriered by the fact that, oh yeah, we cannot go out and wear T-shirts that say climate change is real, or bands, wristbands. There are a lot of the activist undertones. Scientists are turned off by that. So, as responsible citizens, what is it that we can do within the so many 100 weeks left of our lives that can change a few things, the problems that were addressed, and how can we be more responsible, or should we be more responsible? So I'm kind of hitting at the to advocate or not advocate school of thought here. Thank you.
Great question. Go for it.
Awesome question, right? So, I mean, one big thing I would say is that, to think that you're separate from your science, I think is false, right? You are, like you brought up, we're each individually passionate about what we do, and that's why we do it. And so in a way, you're an advocate through the type of scientific research you do. Obviously, following the scientific method is, obvious in what you're doing. But in terms of, I mean, as a professor at a university, I mean, my whole goal is to eliminate complacency, right? I'm presenting evidence-based information to you as a student, to you as a community member, to you as whoever, and I want to kick you out of your complacent period and get you to your next, electron level or whatever. But the idea is teaching what that is. The other thing is generating information. So somebody talked about disciplinary boundaries and how it's important to have them, and we're showing how we're working across and dissolving boundaries. But the important thing is you generate data that's a boundary object, so that the data you're generating or your outputs or your communication tools can actually work in each of those different designated boundaries. So if I produce a data set that an environmental health scientist can look at to understand soil quality data and plant uptake for near mining communities, then it's like that same data is applicable to a community member living in that space to make a decision about what they're going to eat. To the same point where that information is useful for a policymaker to make a decision about how to remediate a contaminated land. And so I feel that getting people out of a state of complacency, like essentially generating data that can move beyond boundaries and be applicable in different spaces. And 3, recognizing that, that you are, as a scientist, advocating by what you decide to research.
Anyone want to try to follow up on that? Don, you looked like you wanted to say something about that. No? Okay, well, you pretty much, I guess. I
could, but she said it better than I would.
Okay, yes, that was pretty good. But I guess I would like to respond to that just briefly. And that is, I think we all have different roles to play. Each one of us brings different talents to the table. And I think the most important thing is that we have to be self-aware about where our biases are and what we are trying to accomplish. It isn't that scientists shouldn't be part of a communication that is actually really important, that scientists become part of communication, but they need to be self-aware about it and really evaluate what role they're taking and why. That's my 2 cents, and nobody asked me. Okay, yes, Diana.
Yeah, so following up on that, I think it's particularly risky for social science to do the advocacy, because there's so much confusion both amongst policymakers and the public about what social science is. And particularly in the climate area, a lot of people don't understand the difference between sort of social science, policy analysis, policy and politics. So I guess it's a comment, but maybe also a question, is that we need to make sure that the social science work is incredibly robust. And it's a common question I've asked in some of these other fora, which is, in the work that you're doing, how do you make sure that what you're doing is robust? For example, when you just do a survey and ask people some questions, how are you in your research knowing that they're giving you answers that are robust? So typically, if you're doing something that's interviewing policymakers about something they did in the past, they've already invented a story about what they did. They may not be reporting to you what they actually thought at the time. Or with individuals, when you're interviewing them, quite often what you're asking them about is something that is not a priority for them, it's not salient to them, they may not have thought about it. So there again, that gets at the sort of validity of what you're asking. So it's really a question about, before social scientists become advocates, how do we make sure that the social science is robust? because we're always being compared to natural sciences and thought of as less rigorous or softer or whatever.
Anyone want to take that?
So I just wanted to give one example. Exactly what Diana and Kathy said, that is exactly what I was thinking, is that, I think my position is a little bit different. I think that scientists need to dial back. I think we have gone into the area we are doing too much advocacy. And I will give you an example of from economics. Development economics, in particular in the last 20 years, has been completely paralyzed. We have, on one hand, we have Jeffrey Sachs, who believe that he has a solution in science to end the global hunger. All countries need to do is contribute 1% of their GDP to poor countries, and game over, everything is beautiful. There is not a single person on the planet who is poor or going hungry. On the other hand, we have a very prominent economist, William Easterly, who used to be a senior economist at the World Bank, very influential now at New York University, who thinks that it is exactly the opposite. International aid is perverse. It is creating perverse institutions in Asia, in Africa, so it is polar apart. And these things are mainly because it is their argument is based less on evidence and science, more on ideology, where the very well-trained, prominent economists have assumed the role of advocates. And I think the middle ground is that, evidence-based. It's okay, international aid works, it may not work, it is contextual, some place it is successful, some place it is not successful. Let's go by science, let's evidence speak for itself, So I think we need to dial back a little bit.
Evidence schmevidence, right?
Well, one big thing, I guess, is I don't hope that you think our response was like, go get a picket, start picketing outside or, doing, I think it's about ethics, right? If you're generating evidence-based, you're doing data collection, and in my case, I'm understanding exposures to pollutants that cause cancer, right? You're understanding an exposure to something that could cause a severe health effect. Everything that we're talking about here has a large, harm to humans, right? But the other thing is that, in saying that people might not be thinking about this, I completely disagree. I work in communities neighboring waste. You don't think they are thinking about this, and they are worried about it. And with climate change, I'm working with communities that are going to be disproportionately affected by climate change. And so they're thinking about how are they going to have enough water, and they're thinking about if they're going to be able to keep their energy bill down, and they're thinking about if their grandma's going to get heat stroke at that summer, right? And, it's not that we don't recognize bias in responses, right? But there is and recognizing that there is a rigor, obviously, to social science. And then clarifying the difference between environmental activism and environmental science, right? There's a difference between generating an evidence-based data set and then putting yourselves in positions to communicate those who need it, right? The translation of the information versus being an environmental environmental activist, right? There's this clear distinction between those terms.
Okay, I'll go out on a limb here and say that climate is a game changer with respect to the rules for scientists speaking out. I think if we look back in the history of the environmental movement, Rachel Carson, Paul Ehrlich, and then the climate science, Jim Hansen, Steve Schneider, there are scientists who have changed the way that society thinks about these questions. And if you accept the major premise that climate is an existential threat to human society and ecosystems as we know them, it seems to me it follows that at least some of the constraints on scientists speaking out have to be relaxed. And that absolutely has to happen, as all of the people I just mentioned, and I think the people Monica is referring to also, the science has to remain absolutely strong and rigorous. But I think in all those cases, these were some of the best scientists in the world, and they simply took a public stand. They became public intellectuals. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're becoming advocates in the sense that one might define the term narrowly, but I think they are becoming public advocates in the broader sense of that term, and that is breaking the bounds of the academy and speaking to society at large.
I guess One anecdotal is that I received some funding from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, and years ago, I was probably 2013, I was at a meeting where it had to be clarified to a scientist that we had to be very careful with how we presented our data and that we weren't lobbying and whatnot. And all of us were like, what, lobbying? You know, obviously we, like, you know, in our college, our dean is a certified or registered lobbyist, right? So there's like obviously protocols you follow. But what we asked ourselves is that if we're doing research translation and community engagement and we're generating data and putting it in the hands of those who need it, and they themselves are deciding to do something with that that might be picketing, might be a form of advocacy, might be working with a non-governmental organization and using that data, you know, we asked, is that considered, you know, some type of political or lobbying act? And it was very clear that we had to document everything we do. So this move, like, you know, releasing and allowing more freedom in how research is translated and used definitely needs to happen. And to get that type of messaging from your funding institute at a federal level, you know, when you want to see change, but being told you know, you have to be very careful with how you communicate it was a little scary.
Yes.
That one of your goals is to overcome complacency, and I think that's the difference that makes a difference. And I think that really defines what a truly world-class responsible scientist is all about. Because I think we live in a time where you really got to make a difference, and that's the bottom line. So I think this issue of you know, forget about advocacy. Just communicating science is an attempt to overcome the complacency in the society. And, you know, it's an incredible task because most people aren't trained to be good communicators. And I think that that's what we all have to be now. Thank you.
Other questions? So I'm going to ask one, and that has to do with complexity. It seems like a lot of the issues in terms of communication, the real breakdown has to do with so many factors being involved. It is really difficult to separate the sort of social components and the, you know, natural system components. And how do you deal with complexity when you're trying to explain to somebody's grandmother, or you're trying to really help people understand whether or not, you know, they should be replanting the same trees that were there before the fire? I mean, how do we get past this complexity problem? Don.
I'll start, but I think every person here runs into this issue. It's not only complexity, I'll just add, make the problem even more difficult. It's the uncertainty about trajectories. So for ecosystems, there are these alternative metastable states that I referred to earlier. We don't know what ecosystems that we grew up with are going to look like 100 years from now. And so that uncertainty, which is driven by the complexity of the systems and their response to the physical and factors, and those in turn are governed by the social decisions made about land management. It leaves us really not having a clear endpoint to communicate it. So it's more difficult than, say, if you have a polluted stream and you can say the fish are going to die unless you do something. Well, that's a clear, short-term, small-scale response that people tend to understand. But if we say that forests of the interior Western North America are going to look very different from the forests we grew up with, and you know, the 2 generations from now there will be a shifting baseline where they never will have seen these conifer forests, for example, and that to them the West will have been always in their lifetime a land of shrubland and grasslands. That uncertainty is actually bounded by a lack of direct experience with what the systems were like before we started to modify them. So I in a way that I guess I would come back to the complexity and say it's the way the complexity is the root of our uncertainty about the trajectories, which makes it very difficult for us to even warn people about potential consequences.
Others want to jump in on complexity? Casey?
Sure. So I'll sort of echo what Don was saying, which is that when I've had interviews with reporters, et cetera, and I've spoken to them about what they really want to hear is something extremely tangible and solid. They don't want to hear the complexities. They don't want to hear the nuances. They want to know, yes, there's going to be all this really huge increase in mosquito-borne disease. It's sexy. It sells their newspaper, et cetera. And I have had interviews where I have been very balanced and tried to convey all of those subtle nuances, and they said, so you mean the scientific community doesn't really know much about this yet? And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that it's complicated and that there's a lot of uncertainty, but we do know a lot. And I think that that's a struggle we all face, is how do you actually communicate this so you don't lose face in the scientific community, but yet you are able to convey that urgency and the importance of what is happening to the public. And I find that I still struggle with that. So I don't think I have a really great answer for everybody here.
Okay, you want to go next, or Chris? Okay.
That it is another aspect of education, and so that the sort of the transmission of this information isn't sort of just passive, that you ideally would want to engage people enough that they're willing to meet you part way. And I think you could do that through making it something built on something that they actually care about or that they're already interested in, and so that they actually work with you to not just hear information, but to sort of build up that picture of the world, that science that you're trying to communicate to them. Because I think without that, people will forget it, or they'll be resistant to it, or they'll misunderstand it.
So I wanted to actually, this is very relevant. So I am involved in few large scale experiments on how to communicate, So let's say, so how to communicate complexity, there's no one hard and fast rule, it is case by case. So, but one thing is that there is overwhelming evidence that when you have any kind of information, how complex it is, how you tailor it, how you communicate has an impact on whether people act upon the information or not. So for example, in behavioral science, particularly in behavioral economics now, so it is very new area. So one overwhelming finding is that humans are subject to more sensitive to loss aversion than gain. So like, let's say, if I want to think about how to communicate about climate change and adaptation, the same information you will have depending on if you say that, okay, if you do this, your agricultural productivity will increase, chances of that being adopted is much lower than if you say that if you do this, you will prevent your loss by this much or something. So we are more biased, sensitive to human by nature. We are loss aversion. We want to protect the bottom line than to think about gain. It is exactly like on epidemiology, in obesity. If you tell people that, hey, if you run every day, you will lose weight and you will live longer. A lot of people say that, they are adapted. I'm doing fine. So it doesn't work. But if you tell people that, if you continue doing that, you will have a heart attack and your child will have not father or mother, right? So that kind of communication, how you tailor, has a strong effect on whether people act upon the information. And
just wanted to follow up on the comments about the participate, like meeting, having them meet you halfway. I would argue again. So as I do citizen science and public participation in the scientific method because, right, one big thing is that why not do it together if it can be done? Have people generate their own hypothesis, organize the data in ways that they might think to frame it, recognizing multiple forms of knowledge, and also the cultural model of communication. So you have some understanding of who you're trying to talk to. Right? You're not using a one model fits all. And so when you have that cultural understanding or use a cultural model of in my case, with risk communication, you're recognizing that, one, you're involving them in the judgment of what risks to evaluate. So what exposure routes would be important to understand. But also you're communicating the risk to give that person some ownership and level of assertion and have control over what happens next. And so one thing with complexity with environmental health, right, is that in risk you have a whole variety of assumptions in your exposure assessment, and then you compare it, and then you'll say, okay, there could be 5 excess cancer cases out of 100,000 people over a lifetime. And so to build that type of number, you have multiple assumptions. But when you reveal those assumptions, right, you unveil the mathematical model and you let people plug in values that actually make more sense to them, totally changes the risk communication process. And also, yes, that's all.
Okay. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. I want to thank our panelists for being brilliant and for what they do every day to both help people understand life as we know it and will know it, and sort of the future generations that we're all investing in. So thank you so very much, and thank you to all of you for coming in and joining in this conversation. It means a lot to have such a good audience, so thanks a lot.